The FCC is absolutely delighted to welcome Christine Negroni. She's an aviation expert, and she's more than that because she's an aviation crash expert. Now, the good news is that despite the trove of knowledge and culture that she has accumulated over the last 20 years related to plane crashes, she still flies. So she arrived yesterday from New York to talk to us and to address another large conference which is taking place in Hong Kong at the moment. And yes, so she will tell us what she found out about MH370 and many other crashes that she studied. Please welcome Christine Negroni.
Hello, everyone. Many years ago, my son got his finger caught in the door. And we took him to the doctor, and the doctor said, oh, he needs a pediatrician. We took him to the pediatrician. He said, oh, he needs a pediatrician who specializes in hands. And then we took him to the pediatrician who specializes in hands, and I said, is left hand or right hand? I'm not so sure I'm in the right specialist department. So when you said, I specialize in air crashes, I just want you to know I'm a specialist. So anyway, I'm so very delighted to be here. Thank you so much, Florence, and thank you, Hilda, wherever you are, for nudging me along. She's been very good about keeping me organized. It's lovely to be in the Foreign Correspondents Club. This is a robust club. Holy smokes, I can't believe it. There's people everywhere. There's a bar, my favorite place, restaurant. It's very nice. So good on you for the journalism in Hong Kong, because obviously it's still kicking. We can't say the same in New York. So I want to thank you for that. I also want to tell you why I'm in Hong Kong, because I was actually invited to come here by the International Air Transport Association, which every year gets together with the communications professionals in the aviation industry, the airlines that are members, and also with government communication specialists and air crash, aviation departments, and they have a confab, and they actually try and discuss how they can do their jobs better. Isn't that amazing? I love that. And so they invited me to come and participate with them. And so if you have anything you want to tell the aviation press executives, you might want to whisper in my ear before the lunch is over. I saw the movie Sully on Friday, shortly before I got on the plane to come here. Has anybody seen it? I'm the only one in the room? No, oh, but that would be the problem. Okay, well, it had a blockbuster opening in New York, $35 million in 3 days, the most money that an Eastwood film has ever made in the opening weekend. So this is just a sign that this story started in 2009 is still not over yet. There was a controversy. I wrote a story about this for the New York Times, that the movie deviates from the facts of how the National Transportation Safety Board investigators intersected with Captain Sullenberger and First Officer Skiles. It might not have actually happened the way it's depicted in the movie. I did a story, as I mentioned, and I spoke to one of the movie's producers, and I asked about that. And I asked Captain Sullenberger as well why there was this deviation from the facts. And I was told, well, it's their perception of the way it happened. Okay, it's their perception. The interesting thing about that is what I suspect is that it probably had more to do with how you tell a story that everybody already knows. Right? There's no spoiler alert with the Miracle on the Hudson flight. We know what happened. So on that note, I'm going to talk about the myths of Malaysia 370. And the same, I found that I was actually in the same category as the Sullenberger movie, and that I am also writing a book, which I meant to, there's my book. I meant to shill it shamelessly, my book, The Crash Detectives. Which is about something that everyone seems to think they know about. And at the same time, everyone seems to think they know nothing about. It's a challenge to try and write something like that. Florence has written her own book, so we compared notes on that kind of a challenge. But in any event, so that is the first myth. And I want to also explain how I happen to be involved with covering Malaysia 370. I work on a part-time basis for an American television network, and I'm their aviation safety consultant. And I happened to be asked to come out to Malaysia when the plane first disappeared to help them with their coverage. Now, while I do occasionally appear on television for them, it's not really my primary job. My primary job is to guide their coverage. When they go to a news conference, suggest questions. When they get answers, suggest that maybe those answers don't make sense or need to be fleshed out in this way or that. What I really get paid for is what's inside my head. And inside my head is a whole passel of index cards on which are the various aviation disasters that I have written about over the past 20 years. So you don't want to be inside my head. It's a nasty place, especially when you're on an airplane. But as we covered the story for ABC, and I got there around the 12th or the 13th, that was the day that things changed in the coverage of the investigation, because that was the day, or the days, don't pin me to the exact day, those were the days when they first discovered that the airplane had not fallen into the South China Sea, but in fact had turned back. So metaphorically, it was a turning back for us as well, because we had to rethink the way this accident could have happened. One of the index cards that leapt from the back of my brain to the front of my brain is the crash of an airplane called Helios 522. And in that case, and in Malaysia 370, I started to think about a possible scenario. And that scenario, he's nodding his head, is an incapacitation of the pilots, and that the plane was in fact a ghost flight or a zombie flight. And that came to my mind because of my experience and because of these other accidents. So before I explain to you exactly what that incapacitation was, I want to just give you a brief tutorial on hypoxia. We all live here at ground level or something like ground level, and there's a nice pressurization in our air that naturally occurs that pushes oxygen into our systems and lets it fly back out. When we're in an airplane, it's the same amount of oxygen in the air we breathe up there, but if I can use a non-technical term, it's airier. It's more diffuse. So we don't get that pressure into our lungs and out. That's why, forgive me, I know this is very basic, but I want to make sure you understand. That's why when you get on an airplane and your ears start to pop and the pressure starts to fill the airplane, that's so that you can breathe. That keeps you happy and content reasonably on an airplane in the 21st century. So that's the way it's supposed to work. But it doesn't always. Sometimes an airplane will, for various reasons, lose pressurization. And when it does, it can happen in two ways. It can happen slowly, in which you are unaware of the fact that the pressurization is leaking out of the airplane. A seal should break, a small rupture somewhere. And you might not notice that you're not getting the right amount of oxygen. And you'll start to feel a little dizzy and lightheaded and intoxicated and charming, delightful, and attractive, and all the things you want to be, just like you're drunk. That's a nice kind of hypoxia, but you don't want to stay there because you'll soon turn into an idiot, which is really not the way you want to live the rest of your life. The other kind of depressurization is called a rapid decompression, sometimes even called an explosive decompression if the plane comes apart at the same time. But in any event, in the rapid decompression, you'll know right away something's amiss. And it won't be a matter of feeling a state of bliss, because you'll be completely preoccupied by what's happening to your body, which is all the air in it is rushing out of it. I'll leave the rest of that to your own imagination, but it won't be pleasant. So these are the kinds of events that happen that can create hypoxia. So, and this, by the way, I should have explained this picture. This is me and some EVA Air cadets, pilot cadets, attending a hypoxia training where we actually had the opportunity to feel the sensation of what it's like to be at 25,000 feet without supplemental oxygen. And the picture of me in the corner is me before I encountered hypoxia and then after when I passed out. That was a minute of not even bliss, but just complete and total not there. So in the case of a hypoxic crew on Malaysia 370, This is my scenario of what happened to the pilots and why I believe this is the scenario of what happened. They were at an altitude of 35,000 feet, and the period of high workload was over. I believe at this time, the captain left the cockpit. He could have been going to the bathroom. Certainly understandable. He'd been in his chair for 3 hours. He was a man in his 50s, probably had a cup of coffee. We can excuse him for going to the bathroom. I think wherever he was not in the cockpit. And at that time, the first officer was in command of the aircraft. I think there was a sudden decompression. And I think that our 27-year-old first officer, Farik, knew exactly what to do. He knew he needed to put on his mask. But I don't think he did it first. I think the first thing he did was go to the transponder and alert, we have an emergency. And in that case, he would change the transponder to 7700. That's the emergency code. So that all the other pilots around in air traffic control, everyone would know he had an emergency event. But the time of useful consciousness, when you are at 35,000 feet and have a sudden decompression, and you are a smoker, which makes it worse, would be 5 to 15 seconds. So I think he erroneously put the transponder in standby and then donned his mask. Now here's the second big if. If he put on his mask, why did he not come to? And I think in this case, he went from hypoxia to a slow and insidious hypoxia because I don't think his oxygen mask was working. I don't think it was working sufficiently. The oxygen canisters for that flight had just been topped off and then reinstalled. And I'm not going to go into the details about how that can actually cause complications. That's in my book, and you have to buy my book. But suffice to say that there's reason to believe after the servicing of crew oxygen canisters, there can sometimes be complications with getting enough oxygen to the masks. If Farik was not getting 100% oxygen, pushing oxygen into his lungs, he would not be getting sufficient oxygen to make an intelligent decision. Okay, now, I have left Zahari in the bathroom. Let's get him out of there. I think he's in there. I think he has an oxygen mask has dropped down in the bathroom because they are equipped with oxygen masks, and he had to make a decision. Do I stay in the bathroom with this oxygen mask and trust Farik to do the right thing, or do I try to get back to the cockpit? And I think he tried to get back to the cockpit. Because he was a 27-year-old first officer, he wasn't even qualified on the aircraft yet. I mean, that's what I would have done. But I don't think he got back there. And other Malaysia Airlines pilots I spoke to who work on that equipment, the Boeing 777, say that it is unlikely he would have been able to get out of the bathroom, down the hall, and into the cockpit in the few moments he had. So I don't think Captain Zahari ever got back to the cockpit. Now, so how does this wind up with the plane making across the country and flying around to the north and then to the south? I think that in those circumstances, when you have a pilot who is operating with very decreased mental capacity, he would have been trying to get back to something familiar. Kuala Lumpur, Penang, maybe Langkawi, which is the direction the plane turned when it started to turn to the north, where Farik learned to fly. And it might not have been an unusual thought for him to think he would go back to a place to which he was familiar. It had a long runway. His airplane was heavy. Perhaps he was thinking that. But whatever he was thinking, it wasn't logical. All we know is the plane went off on a course that defies explanation and then disappeared like a zombie flight into the South Indian Ocean. Okay, so I've spun a great story. And you are completely within your rights to say, well, yeah, Christine, how'd you come up with that one? And the reason, we go back to that index card of mine, is because of this flight, Helios Flight 522. Flight 522 was a Boeing 737 that took off from Crete on its way to Athens. In this case, the pilots failed to pressurize the aircraft on takeoff. So when it was exceeding 10 to 12,000 feet, all of a sudden the masks fell down and the pilots got a warning that the airplane was not pressurized. By this point, however, both the pilot and the first officer were already confused and could not discern what the warning horn was telling them. So rather than put on their masks, they tried to diagnose the horn. They couldn't understand what the horn was telling them, which is a signal already that they were compromised. So both of them passed out, and the plane continued its ascent and on autopilot all the way to Greece, where it crashed into a mountain. Now, just as an aside, because it's an interesting tidbit, irrelevant to the Malaysia 370 story, there was someone actually on the airplane who was getting oxygen, and despite the fact that everyone else was almost certainly dead after 2 hours, he was still alive. He was a flight attendant who was training to be a pilot, and on this flight, somehow he got enough oxygen, perhaps with the crew oxygen bottles, to stay alive until 2 hours before the flight, 2 hours after the flight was going, and he entered the cockpit, where he found the first officer slumped over the controls and the captain behind, by the equipment panel behind his seat. He got into the captain's seat and put on the captain's oxygen mask, started transmitting, unfortunately unsuccessfully, to explain the plight of the airplane. And 7 minutes later, when the last of the fuel went through the engines, the plane crashed and he was killed. He was the last survivor on that flight. It's a tragic story and a horrible story, and everyone I tell it to is like, that's awful. But when I tell people in the aviation industry about this, they have a curious response. It's different from what the general public thinks. They find it incredible. They say, how could a pilot not do the very thing they're told to do? Put on the mask first. And that, to me, explains a disconnect, even within the aviation industry, about the insidious nature of hypoxia. You can't remember to do the right thing because you can't remember. It's a defeating your very alarm mechanism. So when people say about Malaysia 370, it couldn't have happened that way because the pilots know ... I think back to Helios 522. I think back to American Transair Flight 406, which had a similar case in which the pilots got the warning horn but failed to put on their masks. That plane landed successfully, but if I were to describe the comedy of errors that went on in that cockpit, with one guy falling unconscious and being revived, and then the second guy falling unconscious and being revived, and the flight attendant coming in and passing out, you would laugh. You would laugh. It's the comedy of errors, but it's a real indicator of what happens in the case of hypoxia. So, what this tells me is that when Hishamuddin Hussein, who we all know from being the front man for the Malaysia 370 investigation, gets up there and says, this is an unprecedented event, we've never had anything like this, that's a myth. That's what it tells me, it's a myth. We have had events like that. So when I got back to New York after I left Malaysia and decided I was going to write this book, I started doing some research. And I Googled around and I got to YouTube, and I saw a YouTube video in which they showed an airliner and they said, what happened to the modern airliner and all the people on board? And had the plane been hijacked? Had there been sabotage? Was there government interference? A number of theories were teased in this promo. And I thought, wow, drama, intrigue, this is the book I'm going to write. But it wasn't about Malaysia 370. It was about another airplane that disappeared without a trace. Oops. And that, I don't want to get to the next scene just yet. That was the Hawaii Clipper. It was a seaplane that took off in 1938 from Guam and never arrived in the Philippines. No piece of it, unlike Malaysia 370, no piece of it has ever been found. Not luggage, not wreckage, not oil, not anything. It's gone. It was not even the first airliner to go missing. The first airliner to go missing was the Southern Cloud in 1931. This was a flight on the way from Brisbane to Melbourne. Turned out, many years later, I just happened to visit the wreckage site this year, that it was found in the 1960s. But that was the first airliner to go missing. So, and then you can see the list of others. You didn't want to be flying in 1947, 48, or 49 for sure, because that was not a good era for airplanes. So Malaysia wasn't the first airliner to disappear, But I think that expression of unprecedented that we heard ad nauseum had the effect of creating a greater mystery. It had the effect of saying that everything that was happening, all that nonsense of government intrigue and conspiracy theories and speculation and crazy behavior on behalf of the investigation, that was somehow new and had never happened before and something we should take notice of. Well, certainly we should take notice of it, but we've seen these things before. So my book, as it turned out, wasn't going to be just about Malaysia 370. It was going to be about the Hawaii Clipper as well. And just because I find it fascinating, and you might too, look at the parallels between these two accidents, these two disappearing airplanes from over the course of 76 years. When the Hawaii Clipper disappeared, people said this was a modern, spacious airliner, just the state of the art. Same for the Boeing 777. There were experienced and well-respected captains on board. They were lost over vast oceans. We're not talking the South China Sea, the Pacific, the South Indian Ocean, big bodies of water. They flew for hours, making enormous search zones. See my point above about the enormous, vast expanses of water. And they disappeared, and this is particularly interesting to me, they disappeared at a time and in a region of geopolitical conflict. Tensions between the Japanese and the West, tensions between Islamic countries and the West. These are parallels to me, relevant parallels. So the next myth, and I see how much things really are alike, my next myth is this. We've heard this, right? We gotta find those black boxes. They're everything. Without the black boxes, we won't know what happened to Malaysia 370. I think this is a dodge. I think this is a dodge that the Malaysians and the Australians are using because they're not looking at the things that they could be looking at, and they're spending a lot of money for stuff they're unlikely to find, which is the wreckage. There are cases, not a lot of them, but there are cases in which the flight data recorder or the cockpit voice recorder have not been found, and a probable cause for the accident has been determined. Or they found the black boxes, but they weren't illuminating. We have heard that in Malaysia 370, there is concern that the black boxes will not be illuminating, considering that the cockpit voice recorder would have been long recorded over by the time that plane hit the water. So a lot of money, millions of dollars have been spent trying to find the airplane. But there's a lot of information on the ground. Here's information that we haven't heard much about, but could be illuminating. What's the maintenance history of this airplane? What's the crew oxygen problem that required them to remove those oxygen bottles and service them prior to that flight? Where are the logbooks? What do we know about that cargo, the famous lithium-ion battery cargo, not to mention the mangosteens? What about the loss of the ACARS and the satellite? The plane lost power early on, and then it came back on. Why? There are reasons this would happen. How come we don't know what those reasons are? And the turnaround to Kuala Lumpur and the wreckage, these are things that we haven't heard a lot about, but these are things that aren't in the ocean with the plane. These things are on the ground. So knowing that my opinion is that many times investigations are not looked at with the probity perhaps they deserve, I'd say the next myth is this: air accident investigations are objective. I don't think that's true. And even though we often think, look, it's metal, it's science, it's chemistry, it all adds up to be fact, fact, fact. And that may be the case, but the very strong element that goes with it is the motivations of the parties who have something to gain or lose in the investigation, and they really should not be overlooked. Many factors are manipulated, are misunderstood, and they're subject to pressure. The stakes are very, very high, and I'm going to talk to you briefly about the Dreamliner because I think it's a good example of how objective investigations can be or cannot be when the stakes are high. We know the Dreamliner, which came out in 2011, was the world's most modern jetliner at the time, and it had come after being several years delayed, so it was very exciting when it finally was delivered to its customers. It turned into the it turned into the problem child, when batteries on the Dreamliner were started to smoke and emit flames in 2 occasions within 10 days of each other. These were the new lithium-ion batteries, and when they failed in a big and mysterious way. The airplane was grounded for 4 months, and the chairman of the NTSB said at the time, "Fire and airplanes don't mix, ever." She also said that those events cannot be understated. And yet, after 4 months, Boeing decided to put its lithium-ion batteries in a stainless steel housing, which you can see there on the right, and stick a chimney on the end of it and stick it out of the airplane. And the FAA said, "Okay, that's fine, that'll do." So you can have fire and you can have smoke on a Dreamliner battery now, and that's A-OK. Billions of dollars in sales are linked to Boeing. Balance of trade issues in America are linked to Boeing's sale of the 787. And Japan's not a small player in this either. Its 3 largest industries make components for the Boeing 787. So after 4 months, the plane was released to fly again. The problem was still unresolved, but something else played a role: business, commercial, and political issues. There's no follow-up on how the batteries are doing in that stainless steel housing. There is no requirement of Boeing or the operators to even tell the FAA if they have events since the containment has been installed. And they have had events. I know about them, so I called the FAA to find out what the FAA thought of them. And I was told by the FAA, now that the battery problem has been fixed, we no longer track events of fire and smoke on the airplane. So you're talking about in 2006, when this airplane was first, when the FAA first said, "We'll let you put lithium-ion batteries inside the airplane." In between that time and now, 10 years, we've gone from you can never have fire and smoke to fire and smoke is okay. That's, to me, an example of how other factors play a role in the objective air crash investigations. Am I done? Okay, I'm going to wrap it up then. I talked too long on this. I'm going to just wrap it up with this one thing. The last myth is that people are the problem and technology is the solution. It's a myth for a number of reasons, but I'm going to skip right ahead to my last slide and tell you why. We have checklists that are very helpful and yet sometimes confound the pilots. We have technology that sometimes we think is going to help us, but sometimes becomes a runaway train. But finally, the humans that we investigate accidents to find out how humans can perform better. They actually do break the chain to disaster. And when we talk about Sully, and when you go to see the movie about Sully next week, I want you to think about 2 things. He's not the only pilot to avert disaster. He had the ability to think clearly and save the day. That's what humans do over computers. We don't do what we're programmed to do. We do what we need to do when things get tough. Sully and Jeff Skiles had an airplane that couldn't fly, and they found out where and how to put it down safely. The irony with Malaysia 370 is that the pilots couldn't think. If my scenario is correct, they couldn't think, but they had an airplane that could fly, and fly it did, into oblivion and into history. And God willing, someday, perhaps it will reveal its secrets in an ongoing journey to safer skies. And that's my presentation about the myths of Malaysia 370. I know I've run long, so I don't know whether I have a question.
No, it's okay.
I can take questions.
It's fine. We still have 15 minutes for questions. And Christine very kindly is offering a book. She can't sell them yet, unfortunately. And we will offer a book to the next person to fly in the room. So I don't know if someone is flying this afternoon.
Is anyone?
Really? Okay. So it's the perfect book to read on your flight.
Promise me you will actually hold it up like this.
No, I was going to say just cover the cover. But in any case, we'll move to, congratulations, and we'll move to questions. Okay, we'll start with that part of the room. Please introduce yourself and your organization before you put your question.
Hello, I'm Andrew Wood. I'm a business reporter for BBC News. I'm married to a Malaysian. I go to Malaysia a lot, and I fly to Malaysia. Should I fly on Malaysian Airlines? It's my first question. Second question is, what are the other airlines, if any, that you would advise not flying on?
I've only ever advised people not to fly on one airline, and it's in the United States, so I think you're safe.
Do you want to tell us what it is, just to be on the safe side?
Allegiant. It's a low-cost carrier in the United States, and if you read the newspaper, you wouldn't fly on them. I mean, that's how obvious it is.
Seriously, though, what do you think Malaysian Airlines has learned?
I really don't weigh in on individual airlines. I mean, airplane crashes are so rare, and the system is so safe. I think it's the rare airline that is just so mismanaged and mishandled that people really need to worry about them. But I'd say I'd say there's a couple of risk factors. If they come together, you might want to be careful. A low-cost carrier in a lightly regulated country, in a place that has a systemic air traffic control problem, those three things together, maybe you want to rethink your trip. But generally, no, I don't.
Yes, my name's Graham Forbes. I'm a retired pilot. I'm a simulator instructor now. When this happened, the pilot community was shocked. And we all looked at what we thought might have happened. You've gone down the depressurization route. There are other routes. Within the last 24 hours, which is a strange time for it to happen, but they've now recovered panels from the aircraft which are scorched. They've had them on TV, and the panels are clearly scorched, which would indicate some sort of a fire. Now, aircraft don't tend to burn when they hit water. They just tend to sink and break up. Do you think the focus of the investigation is now going to change as a result of that? Because if you're talking about scorched panels, you're talking about fire, and then you're talking about the thing that frightens pilots the most, really, which is smoke. What are your thoughts about that? It's
interesting, and if you've given me 30 seconds to think about it, so please just bear that in mind when I respond. You're right. Airplanes don't scorch in the water. So it would raise to me the question of whether whatever the problem was with the oxygen perhaps might have led to a fire in the cockpit. But there's one thing we know about a fire. There was no catastrophic fire on that airplane that could have destroyed the airplane to such an extent that it couldn't fly and fly well for 7.5 hours. That's why I've always dismissed the lithium-ion battery fire, because the airplane flew for 7.5 hours at peak performance. So that's a given. So if there were, and oxygen is a fire accelerant, as you know, if there were some kind of a fire in the cockpit, that's pretty interesting, but it was contained. Those pilots did not act as if they were alarmed, because if they were alarmed, they would have called on the radio. They would have made some sort of mayday call. They didn't. That's, to me, the difference. But again, I've just heard this news from you, so I can't respond any more than that. It's certainly very interesting. It would be great, and does speak to the whole point of, finding wreckage is great. You can learn stuff from that.
Thank you.
Even without the black boxes.
My question is, are there any reasons why there's such a lack of interest in developing the black boxes to a sort of modern day technology? Because I understand the technology of the black boxes are pretty primitive, and I think the batteries only last, or the beacons only last about like a month or something like that. So why hasn't people developed something better?
Well, I don't think the technology of the black box is primitive. I think what you're suggesting is that keeping the data on the airplane seems like a primitive notion, and I agree with you. The problem for the past, since Air France, when this issue first was brought up, the problem was at the time that there was not sufficient bandwidth to offload a lot of data, and there are hundreds, if not thousands, of parameters of information just on the FDR, not to mention the CVR. So there's a lot of data they'd need to send, and there's a lot of airplanes in the air at any given time. It's a huge amount of space that would take up. Now, that's the excuse or the explanation, forgive me, that I was being given back when I first started reporting on this in 2009. I think there have been giant leaps in technology, and I know there are companies working on this where maybe you're not downloading all of it, but you're triggering the release of data based on novel events so that you're not sending everything. I mean, what's all that stuff going to do on the ground? But there is also some questions of, who owns the data when it winds up somewhere else. So there are other issues. It's not as simple as just, why don't we just beam it all to Scotty and, the information will be there. And you also have to keep in mind, of all the flights there are a day, 35,000, maybe that's just the US, I don't know, I'm not good with numbers. I'm sorry? 100,000. Perry, International Air Transport Association, will have the number at the ready. It will be, and you're talking about 100,000 flights, all uneventful. They don't need that stuff, for the 3 or 5 in a year that do. So there's, these are the issues that come up.
Hi, Ben Bland from the Financial Times. Given what you're saying about obfuscation in the Malaysian Airlines investigation, do you think if the various governments and investigators had been working together purely to find the real cause, there's enough information sources that they could have come to a conclusion? Or is it simply the case that even if they were working together, there isn't enough information right now to have a definitive view of what really happened?
In the course of writing my book, I interviewed a man who wrote a book about an airplane that flew into the mountains in Bolivia. The Americans and the Bolivians said that they couldn't get enough information. They couldn't get to the plane. They couldn't get enough information. Meanwhile, this guy wrote an entire book with 3 different theories about what happened from his desk. So the reason I'm telling you that is we don't know what we don't know. But we know in order to find out, you need to really start to look. And it's that I don't think they were looking, or if they were looking, they weren't sharing. Because all the focus, all the concentration was out there somewhere where the plane might be. And that, to me, was a waste of time. It was a waste of intellectual energy. Not a waste. That's not, obviously, it's not a waste to try and find the airplane. But it's not the only way to get at the answer. To get at an answer, you have to ask questions, and you have to then look at the answers. And I think there was a lot of that missing. And not just by the Malaysians. I don't think the Australians were all that good at it either. So, and I saw it without maligning any government. My book talks about mishandled investigations across the globe. It's universal.
I'm not from the aviation industry, so I just read the newspapers. My name is Christopher Howe from Anglo-Chinese, which is a banking thing. I wanted to ask, reportedly, this plane flew under pilot control and banked twice over Penang. Is that just a nonsense tabloid story? Because if the plane was in control, banking over Penang, which was the hometown of the pilot, after it had doglegged back from the South China Sea to the Malay Peninsula, then clearly it's likely that something else caused the crash. Secondly, I believe because of this, a forensic investigation was mounted on the pilot's server, on which they found plotted courses which track virtually identically. This is all reported in the news. I have no idea if it's true, but reportedly track where the plane was supposed to have gone down somewhere off Perth in the South Atlantic. And I just wondered, I'm fascinated by what you've said, which sounds very plausible to me, what you'd make of those 2 bits of information.
Let me respond to the first bit of information. Forgive me for not looking at you, because now there's a brick wall in the way. But the first bit of information is this. In my scenario, that plane was handled by a pilot. We can get a pretty good idea that it was handled by a pilot. What we cannot get is intention. And the leap in that scenario to the people who believe this was a terrorist act committed by the pilots or an intentional act committed by the pilot is that leap of, if it was being handled by a pilot, it was being handled by a pilot with an intention of doing X. And that we just don't know. Now, to the second simulator, this is not my story, but Florence knows that story inside and out, so I'm going to beg you to talk to her afterwards. Because this business about from what my understanding is, this business about the pilot server was misreported in the beginning and has only changed quite a bit since. So I'm not really up to it on that.
I have a question about the Dreamliner, the 787. As you mentioned in your wonderful presentation, the response to what I see as glaring safety issues with the battery of the 787, it's amounted to a series of half measures. Do we think that is this an existential concern for the 787? Are the airlines and the regulation authorities playing with fire here? To my knowledge, there haven't been any disasters involving the 787. Is it only a matter of time?
I don't think it's an existential, or it is an existential question until there is an event. But there have been at least 3, and maybe more, events on the Dreamliner in which the batteries went into thermal runaway and vented. So the problem that the FAA said, you can't have this problem in 2006, the reason the reason Boeing even got the authority to put this battery on the airplane was because they weren't going to have fire and smoke. And now they're saying, well, we're having fire and smoke, but who cares? You know, we stuck a smokestack in and we're good to go. That to me is an existential question until you have an event in which somebody gets hurt. And then you'll wonder, why did they not? I mean, it's classic in aviation safety, that there's an accident and then everybody says, well, how come? You can prevent these things, but there was no will to prevent it in the case of the Dreamliner, and I understand completely why. I do. I understand. And there was no way to extract that. In my book, I say it was like trying to take the flour out of cake batter. There was no way to extract that battery and use something else and keep the Dreamliner flying. So they've rolled the dice. Now, I did write a column once in which I suggested Boeing, and I just suspect back there in Seattle, they're working on a way to fix it, and maybe they are, but I kind of thought it would happen already, and it hasn't. But if they did it tomorrow, if they announced it tomorrow, I would say, yeah, Christine, you're a genius. You knew they were going to do it. But so far, I haven't heard.
Thank you.
I'll actually just make one quick comment about the Dreamliner. If you wanted to look a parallel, the DC-10, about known problems being suppressed until disaster struck. My question was, it's been reported in the press that the transponder was turned off by just after the handshake took place, and then the plane started to turn. You said that the transponder was switched to a different medium. Which of the two was it?
Well, if you put the transponder into standby mode, it has the effect of turning it off. In standby is essentially the same thing as off. So where the switch is located on the transponder is very close to where the frequency, they're right next to each other. So I suspect that what he did was turn it to standby instead of turning the dial to change the frequency.
Well,
sorry,
yeah, it prompts a follow-up.
Well, no, it just sounds like that's a disaster in the making, and perhaps that something should be fixed in the airline.
Very interesting that you should say that, because there was an accident. That index card has just come to the front of my brain. There was an accident in Brazil in which a small private business jet flew into a 737 airliner. This was the matter of the little business jet that lived and the 737 that did not. But when the plane landed and the authorities came, they said, how come we couldn't see you? Why was your transponder turned off? And they said, we didn't turn the transponder off. And there was a big investigation trying to figure it out. In that case, they suspected that the pilot's footrest was right near the switch to the transponder. Now that you're right, that's another not a good design idea, but they thought that had possibly turned the transponder off. But they never did find out exactly what turned it off. But the pilots said they hadn't turned it off, and there was no explanation for why it had. And it was turned into standby, so it was invisible, which is why the 737 GOL Airlines plane did not know that the plane was out there.
Well, I'm afraid we have to leave it there. We have thousands of more questions, including me, obviously. But thank you so much, Christine. And we have a little souvenir for you. And I suggest we just give a
I hope it's your book in English.
It will be coming soon. Thank you. So.